Good morning. This is Jason Dean at Film Fanatic, live at Film Fanatic headquarters. Hope everyone's doing good. It's Wednesday at about 9:30. So yeah, as we're getting closer and closer to Christmas, I figured why not do a video on coverage of a GG Allin documentary. I mean, why not? But this was a documentary, and again, I've only done a few shows on some documentaries. I believe I only did one show that was called For All Mankind, which was a documentary about the first uh, mission to Mars. One of my all-time favorites. The factor about the main one of the main things about that film and that documentary is the use of music, particularly by the genius that is known as Brian Eno. He did all the music for it. That's one of the most breathtaking experiences ever that you'll see. One of my favorite documentaries. I've been wanting to do more docs. I'm a huge fan of documentaries, and I have a pretty good collection. I acquired a bunch of them. I had mentioned it before in a previous show, but about 5 or 6 years ago, I should say a little less, there used to be a shop in Camden, Maine. I used to work in Camden, so I was there a lot. There used to be a shop called Harbor Auto Video, and it was a video rental place, basically. And they had a really great selection overall. It was a really, a pretty sizable place. It was big, and they had, your assortments of lots of new releases, and they had a pretty good horror selection. But their specialty always seemed to be documentaries and also foreign films. They had tons of docs and foreign films. So I went through a bunch of bouts of where I was watching lots of documentaries for a long time. I've always loved them, but I used to rent them a lot there, along with other films and other genres. But when they closed, they had, after I had a membership there for a while, as well as Opera House Video, which I still have a membership to. And I was going to both places a lot. At that time, I was doing, I don't know, a lot of work and some projects that were down in Thomaston. So, and a lot of the times it was on Sundays. So a lot of the times I would come back through town, and I got in this kind of almost monthly or weekly ritual where I would come back through town, through Camden. I would always stop at HAV, and I would always get a bunch of movies. And at that time, my girlfriend lived in town in Camden, so we would do that also. So it became a regular thing. And after a few years of that, which was great, unfortunately due to all kinds of crazy circumstances, that place ended up having to close and go out of business. And the last 2 weeks that they were open, or the last 2 weeks that they were open, they had, they basically were selling everything in house. So I went there like a madman and bought a whole ton of movies. I bought a ton of movies, and I was amazed by some of the things that I bought. They had a pretty decent Blu-ray selection, and I wasn't really buying too many Blu-rays at that point, but I did buy a ton of movies. I did buy tons of documentaries and a lot of foreign films. So I've always had a deep connection to a lot of foreign films. I do love docs, especially now where I was just talking about it with a friend where there is documentaries have moved into where filmmakers are trying or have been adapting a lot of techniques for their style from, I think, full length feature films. So now I feel the last few years, the last seven years or so, whenever I've seen a documentary, they seem to have a real like cinematic quality to them where they've taken on a lot of the aesthetics around films, and so like that line has been blurred. Whereas before, for a theatrical film, you obviously have that experience and the cinematic idea and the cinematic kind of presentation. And documentaries for a long time were very, to a degree, straightforward. They had, a narrative where it was focused on a very specific subject, and it was told usually in real time. It wasn't really. It was a very distinct style from, say, a full length like cinematic, you know, experience from like as opposed to watching, watching a documentary versus a film. There was a distinct style, and now things have like really changed and have shifted where there a lot of documentaries now have adapted or adopted a lot of those kinds of qualities as far as how the narrative is, the use of music, the cinematography, um, and I kind of think it's better in a lot of ways. It makes sometimes documentaries at times back then before I felt that trend started to kind of emerge. They were a little bit more on the dry side. They were a little bit more, you know, focused on the fact of the matter kind of a thing. And now it's adapted these qualities to where it's a little bit more of an escapist thing, along with the way they use music, the editing, especially the cinematography has changed a lot on a lot of documentaries. So it has that quality of where it's a cinematic experience and escapism, even though the subject matter is still, tend can still be pretty hard hitting, and it's obviously set in reality about a very particular subject. So it's pretty cool. And a few years ago, I bought this. Where did I buy this? I bought this documentary. It's called Hated, and it's a documentary about the famous gross out punk rocker GG Allin. It's called Hated GG Allin, and it came out. It came out quite a few years ago, but I bought this. Yeah, I actually bought this on Blu-ray. Um, Actually, I should say I bought this. This is actually a DVD. I bought this at Bull Moose probably about five, 5 or 6 years ago now. This was a documentary I had heard about for a long, long time, and from what I had heard about it and read about it, and I knew one or two people that had seen it. It sounded like it was, something to really a sight to be seen, like pretty unbelievable, pretty a jaw dropping kind of expose about GG Allin. And I had, I wouldn't say I was a fan of GG Allin, but I knew of him when I was a kid. I used to, back in high school. It was also back in the time when magazines and publications were a thing where you could buy magazines, and I still have them, but I had a huge collection, and I still do in my basement, a huge collection of an assortment of all kinds of music magazines, and then also I have a lot of uh, film magazines, and before that, when I was a little kid, I used to collect comic books. So I have like a big trunk filled with all of the mostly the when I was in high school and middle school, I was mostly into metal. I was a metalhead kid, so I got Hit Parader, Rip Magazine. There was a whole ton of different magazines at that time that came out. Metal Edge, and they covered all like the metal bands and stuff at the time. And there was one magazine that was called, I believe it was called Rip Magazine, and that was a metal magazine, but it mostly focused on. They had metal bands in it, but it also had punk bands that they would do coverage of, and then also kind of new age, or not new age, but bands like the Talking Heads and like alternative rock bands, bands like the Pixies and the Sugar Cubes. And that magazine at the time was called Rip Magazine. At that time, that magazine was kind of garnered towards the skater culture, and a lot of kids at that time, skating was a huge thing. I had tried a little bit of skating, and I remember I'd gotten a skateboard, and I tried skateboarding a couple times, and there was one time where I went skating, and I think it was at my house, and I wiped out bad. I wiped out, I almost killed myself, like face planted. And then I was like, I think this is enough. I don't think I'm meant to be a skateboarder. So I never did it again. And but I was always into this magazine because it had lots of non-metal bands. It had lots of different things on there. Like I remember they would have coverage of like you know bands like say Slayer, and then they would have a interview. They have an interview with the members of Slayer, and then they would have a coverage of a band, another band that I loved at that time. I was into a lot of punk rock and metal at that time and hardcore music, but they'd have like a band like DRI, Dirty Rotten Imbeciles, which was one of my favorite punk bands, and they were like a crossover band where they combined elements of punk rock, hardcore, and metal. They were one of the first bands that kind of combined all those styles. And they would have like bands like Gore. Gore would be on the cover of the magazine, and then they'd have like interviews with like Bjork. So they had a real variety of styles. And at the time, kids who were skateboarders were kind of into this kind of stuff. So it was like part of that culture. But I remember they had an article in there with GG Allin, and that's how I first came across who he was. And I was just like, wow, who is this guy? Like this guy, they just talked about how, some of the scenarios of his shows and what would transpire. And he, was this kind of this crazy nihilistic, performance artist, if you want to call it that. And it was punk rock music, and I was like, what is this? And I remember a couple of years after that, I was in Boston, and I went to, I believe it was Newbury Comics, and they had a bunch of his albums. They had a bunch of GG Allin albums with the Murder Junkies. That was the band that he was in most of his career, or at least that he was most well known for. And they had cassettes. They had the cassettes of all of his albums, and I remember buying a couple of those cassettes. And I never really liked his music. I always thought it was. I liked a lot of punk music, but I always thought it was, not that great. And I did listen to some of his music. It was pretty rancid and nasty and raw, which I kind of liked. But the actual songs, I was never a huge fan of. But I don't know, there was some kind of attraction to it. And I read more about him and all of the things that would happen at his shows, where he would he would he would cut himself, and he would get into fights on stage, and a lot of the times a typical performance wouldn't last very long because he would get arrested for basically taking his clothes off. He would defecate on stage. And a lot of the times club owners would call the police, maybe 3 or 4 songs into it, and basically like police with riot gear would show up and tear gas the room. And then his fans were just as insane as he was, where there were situations where his fans would attack him, and he would get beaten up, and then he would beat up people in the audience. And he would defecate and poop on stage, and then throw his poop into the audience, and just complete insanity. And the thing that I always thought about GG Allin was that he was like, at that time, I had, I was for a while when I was a kid, I was a Marilyn Manson fan, and when I kind of discovered GG Allin, and I I wouldn't say I was a fan of his, but his, his, to a degree, like, his mark and for what he did was, it's kind of, unprecedented to a degree. And, he definitely left his mark behind. I always thought of like GG Allin being, kind of being this, you know, uh, if Marilyn Manson was real, like he's like the real Marilyn Manson. Like it wasn't a theatrical thing. It wasn't costumes and fake scenarios and lighting and him playing a character on stage. But Gigi Allen was like the real Antichrist. He did all of these horrendous and heinous things on stage, and it wasn't about using props or selling tickets or you know playing a character. He was playing himself on stage. So I always thought of him as like being Marilyn Manson, but real, but like if Marilyn Manson was a real like person. So and there were all those the classic episodes back, and this was also during the time when like Sally Jessy Raphael was a talk show host, Geraldo Rivera was a talk show host, um, Phil Donahue, and these were the the trashy kind of tabloid talk shows of the day that would have these salacious topics that they would cover during the 80s and 90s, and where they would have neo Nazis on stage and they would be interviewing them. Also, another one was Morton Downey Jr., where it would be outward, just the guests and the audience. There would be these full on like confrontations where they would erupt to where there would be fights, and a lot of the times they would have these neo Nazis on their stage in these various shows, and they would get in these arguments with the audience, and then uh, a riot would basically ensue. One of the biggest ones was back in the day when Geraldo Rivera had a group of neo Nazis on his stage, and an altercation erupted, and he ended up getting his nose broken. And it was also during the time of like the Satanic Panic, of where where there was this whole rash of all of these supposed acts that were committed by Satanists, where people were being kidnapped and used, for human sacrifice, and animals were being, mutilated, and there was churches being desecrated, and all of these things that were happening. So they would have throughout the years they would have on a lot of these shows like Sally Jessy Raphael and Geraldo, they would have, especially those shows, they would have different guests on there that were so-called specialists in that field, where they, worked in the police department or forensics or some other thing, or they were psychiatrists, and they would basically spew all of this BS about, human sacrifice, and then a lot of the times they would have represent representatives from like the Church of Satan on the show, and sometimes occasionally other people who were calling themselves, Satanists to a degree, but they would have, members of the Church of Satan at the time, which is back then and even now is kind of the only legitimate representation of what Satanism is, and they would have these guests on there, and they would basically say, try to spread some to a degree a gospel of truth, and it would just be this circus. It would be just this total circus, and eventually that all of that whole like the Satanic Panic and that whole kind of craze thing that was happening was all proven to be a hoax, and it was literally a modern day witch hunt, and it was all perpetrated by basically evangelical Christians to target a minority uh, religion. And at one point, it got so serious during that witch hunt that there was actual bills on that were possibly going to be passed through Congress and through the Senate, where they were going to basically try to outlaw Satanism and to be called or to be labeled or to label yourself as a Satanist, you could be, you could face, face a fine or face even jail time, or that it was, an illegal activity. Completely insane time that we lived in through that period. One of the guests that was on those shows too during that whole time was, it was also the time of when it was the whole shock rock thing was happening. They would have on her, like, for instance, any of those shows, Sally Jesse Raphael Geraldo, they would have these various guests of people who were like, doing these, you know completely insane things during rock shows. They would have groups like the Mentors, and then it was also the time of the PMRC, the Parental Music Resource, of where censorship was now a thing, of where this could really happen. And then they managed to, start labeling records, but they would have guests, like what they called at the time shock rockers, like groups like the Mentors, and also GG Allin would be a guest on a lot of these shows, and GG Allin was in a separate category to a degree, because what he was doing was actually these real acts, and his audience was kind of counting on to be put through this hell at his show. They knew what they were doing, as far as people, knew that they could get poop thrown at them and be hit and be assaulted physically or sexually, or just total lunacy. But GG Allin was, I remember, a guest on those shows back then, and it was a wild time, And I remember as a kid watching him as a guest, and I'm like, this guy is completely insane. So I had heard about him for a long time, and this documentary, again, came out quite a few years ago. This came out in 1993, and it was the directorial debut of a real, actually famous director, which is, it always blows my mind. And it was directed by Todd Philipps, and he's a pretty famous director. He's most well known for his last film that he did was The Joker, who was played by Joaquin Phoenix, which is an amazing film. And Todd Phillips had a pretty diverse career, or has had a pretty diverse career since then. He's done the Hangover movies, which is so strange to me. He's done quite a few comedies, Due Date, and then also War Dogs. He did Starsky and Hutch. Just a strange combination of films that he's done. And to think that this documentary was his first movie is to me is kind of mind blowing. That he was, he kind of moved into becoming a director of like pretty famous comedies. Just wild. What it like talk about a transition. So the fact to see where Todd Phillips' career evolved is baffling. Like when I first saw this documentary, and I bought it. Like I said, I bought it at Bull Moose because I heard so much about this documentary. Never seen it before, and I'm just like blown away by it. It's kind of like unlike anything I've ever seen before. I mean, I think it's worth, definitely worth the viewing and checking this out. And it's a real glimpse into this totally bizarre kind of subculture, like in the underbelly of punk rock music. What GG Allin did was, I don't look to him as being, say, an iconic rock star or anything, or somebody who is, necessarily legitimate, but I feel like as a character, he's pretty fascinating. And what he did he was a real, you know, provocateur to a degree. Took it to obviously to new heights of extremity, but it's still, I think, him as a character and as a persona. There, he, to a degree, with what he did leave his mark. So, I think in that regard, it's a it's a as far as in terms of a documentary, it's just such an eye-opening experience seeing this film. Just within the first five minutes of this film, it takes basically he's GG Allin is performing, and within a few minutes of the show, he like defecates on stage, and he like throws his poop into the audience, and there's he's taken a bunch of glass cups, and he like smashes them on stage, and he's like cutting himself. And then there's one scene where he like all within, and again it's all within the first 10 minutes of this, where he goes into the audience, and he just like punches this guy in the face and just knocks him out, and it's just like total chaos. I remember watching this with a friend and his girlfriend, and his friend knew who GG Allin was. He was very aware of who GG Allin was, and his girlfriend had never had heard of him, but had never seen this documentary, and had didn't really know all that much about him. And I remember it was a couple of years after I bought this DVD, we watched it, and she was shocked. I mean, at one point I kind of got this feeling she wanted us to like kind of turn it off, like it was, because it's pretty nauseating, but it's something to be seen too. It's a portrayal of this kind of dark underbelly of I guess to a degree like a subgenre of punk rock. But it's a fascinating, as far as documentaries go, and music oriented documentaries. It's definitely one of the best. I mean, and the whole origins of this story of how this whole movie came about. Like originally, this was like a student film for Todd Philipps. When he was in film school, this was going to be his like first kind of time of like throwing his hat in the ring, and trying to make a fully realized movie, a documentary, and this was his first film. And so the footage on this, in this disc, on this in this movie is just mind-boggling. And I have all these interviews with all of the fans, and they're just equally as completely equally crazed and as equally insane as he was. But one of the coolest things about this documentary is there's a bunch of great special features on here, and there's actually an interview with Merle Allin, who was the brother of GG Allin. There's just an amazing interview with Merle Allin, and also Dino Sex, who was the drummer in the band. And it was this whole documentary focuses on the band GG Allin and the Murder Junkies, and that was like he had many other bands, and over, through his time, but he was most well known for the Murder Junkies. That was like his main band, and they put out a bunch of albums at one point. They toured quite a bit. But there's an amazing interview with Merle Allin and Dino Sex, who was the drummer for the Murder Junkies. And Merle Allin played bass, Gigi's brother. And it's basically just the two of them for an hour, and they're being interviewed about their whole experience, like where it kind of all started and where it evolved, to where he became this, shock rocker and just this crazed performer. They talk a lot about where GG Allin, when in his in his childhood, and when he was in his teens, and then when he got into music, he started off as a drummer, and he played in various bands, but he said that at that time, like his brother, Merle Allen is referring to his brother that, or GG, that he had this already, even at that age, he had this kind of uncompromising energy, and that, you got the sense that, well, the drums were not enough for him. He needed to be like out out, as the the lead guy. He needed to be out in front and center. He needed to be like, the lead singer, that main kind of focus. And he eventually, over time, he became a singer, and he got a reputation for doing lots of crazy things during performances. Like during in various punk bands he was playing in, where he would throw tables over and throw glasses of alcohol or beer bottles into the audience. And he said that that was kind of the start to where GG Allin was, just descending into this place of where he was, emerging as this crazed, lunatic on stage. And it eventually, moved into the area of where he started the Murder Junkies, and then it was full bore, and then it was just, total chaos and anarchy. And the other thing too is this documentary has gotten so much acclaim over the years. There was a big review. I think it was put out by Rolling Stone, where they made this whole list. They comprised this list of some of the biggest and most successful and most popular and most sought out documentaries of all time, particularly around rock music. And GG Allin's Hated is like in the top five. It's like right behind like Led Zeppelin and like Black Sabbath. The Led Zeppelin documentary, the song remains the same. Just wild, like how this a figure that was so steeped in this underground culture became, to a degree, like became popular, and crossed these barriers of where, due to his antics, kind of crossed those boundaries and became a pop figure to a degree on a smaller level, but was known by the masses all of a sudden. And one of his things that he did, like especially during the later part of his career, was he had the intention of like killing himself on stage. Particularly, he was centered around he wanted to do this commit suicide on stage during Halloween, and he had told his fans that he also wanted his fans to actually kill themselves also. I mean, just completely insane. He never and it never ended up happening, but he ended up overdosing because he was a really horrendously bad drug addict and alcoholic. I believe he overdosed on heroin. Just insane, and he literally spent many years in jail and prison for various charges, sexual assault charges, endangering audience members, causing riots. I mean, he just had a list of endless charges and fines, and he spent a lot of time in jail because of this. And he was always unrepentant. He was like, he felt like he was almost I don't know, to a degree, like a rock and roll martyr, where he was the guy who was like making rock and roll dangerous, and he needed to be a figure in society to kind of keep the pendulum still, to keep that pendulum in rock and roll, to maybe swing that direction every now and then, and to keep rock and roll dangerous. Just completely insane. But the documentary about the movie, or I should say the interview with Merle Allen and Dino Sex, is actually a fascinating interview. I almost, to a degree, enjoy it more than the actual documentary, because they just talk about all the different facets and all the different stages that they were in, and where they went, and then ever since he died, which happens to celebrities all the time, he's gone on to become this like kind of iconic figure, to where now there's a whole, whole new generations of people who know his music and know who he is, and and also he also has, to a degree, a rabid fan base, which is, just insane. I actually know somebody. I actually know somebody who saw GG Allin in concert. He was down at the time. His name was Max, and he was down in, I think he was in Austin, Texas, and it was in the '80s. I think it was the late '80s, and he was in Austin, Texas, and GG Allin was playing a concert at some club down there, and he went to the concert. And the way he described it, it's just like, it's one of the most amazing and insane stories I've ever heard. Where he went to the concert, and he'd heard about GG Allin, and I don't think he considered himself a fan, but he went to the show, and the band started playing, and everybody, because they assume of what's going to happen, as far as like the audience, possibly being attacked, or getting poop thrown at them, or glass or something. They all stood on the sidelines. No one would come up to the front of the stage, because by this time he had been touring a lot, and he had this, monstrous reputation. And I remember Max was saying that, like, when he was at the show, he was on the outskirts the whole time. He stood like far in the back, as far as possible, and the audience would not get up front. They were scared, like kind of intimidated. And then I guess all hell broke loose, and he started to kind of do his thing where he started cutting himself, and I think poop started flying, and then it all happened. Max said it happened like within, you know, maybe a half hour or so after they started playing, and all of this, chaos started happening. And he said that the police, the club owner, the security, whatnot, they called the police, and he said that within 5 minutes the whole venue was filled up with police officers, like in riot gear, and they basically tear gassed the entire club. And so everybody went, flying out, and everybody left. And it was like, I think about 35 minutes in, when the show was canceled. And then that was it. And that was his experience seeing GG Allin. I mean, just complete and utter chaos. And they throughout the documentary, they talk about how they, very rarely made it through a performance because of those things, because those things happened, where the club owners would shut the place down when things would just go into this total, like, when the insanity would ensue on stage or with the audience. Typically the cops would be called, and then you would have all these scenes of where the show would be shut down. And they talk about that they were, like, whenever they were on tour, they were amazed, because it was apparently a rare thing when they were on tour that they could play a full set and not have that happen, because of all of the craziness that would usually ensue at his shows, because he would incite these things. Just wild, just a wild, like, completely insane persona he was there. And it's interesting too, because I've had this discussion about when you're a rock star, or somebody is accused of certain things and not accused of certain things with their fans, or if the fans are willing participants in various forms of debauchery. How does that work, and how does that legitimize itself? One of the big things I remember, it was it's hard to believe it's been a couple of years, but last year was the time when Marilyn Manson got basically brought up on all of these charges of sexual assault, and basically kidnapping and holding his girlfriend as a slave, and keeping her at his will, against her will. And he got brought up on all of these sexual charges. And I kept thinking during that whole time, and and again, I feel like probably some of those accusations are true, and some of them are probably not true. But as of today and as of now, as far as I know, Marilyn Manson has not been brought up on any, or hasn't been proven guilty in any of the charges. And I remember when that whole story broke. The first thing I thought about was GG Allin. He was the first person I thought of, and I was thinking, well, it was like all of these things that Marilyn Manson was accused of doing, in his life, and even at shows, but mostly like in his life. GG Allin did it at concerts. Like he outwardly assaulted people and sexually assaulted people, physically assaulted them, got in confrontations, all kinds of debauchery. And I'm like, well, this was a figure that outwardly this is what he did, and this was like, he to a degree he was this real like antichrist figure. And then you have on the other side of things where Marilyn Manson is a rock star and he's being accused of these things, and they haven't been proven. He hasn't been proven guilty, and he basically lost his entire career because of it. I think some of those charges are probably accurate, some of them are probably not. But at the end of the day, he hasn't been convicted of anything. And I remember getting into a discussion with a friend about that. Like how, like, where's that line drawn, and what really falls under the line of being criminal. And she made a point of saying, well, as far in regards to GG Allin's audience, you know, they would go to his concerts expecting to be, they were going to these concerts as willing participants, and that they knew they would probably get assaulted to some degree, and that they were looking for that, that situation. So they were like willingly going into these places to see him perform, and these things would ensue. So it was a little bit, a different angle. You couldn't really compare it to the same thing. And then also with, and also in regards to where, on one hand, that's true, but I think it also plays into the idea that, you can't, if you scream fire in a crowded theater, or that you're going to murder the president, you're going to be arrested. There's certain things that are not free speech, and that you're going to be arrested for the idea of endangering the greater good. So it's a fine line, and he was, on one hand, she had said, well, it's a different scenario, but at the same time, he was also convicted of, GG Allin was actually convicted of many, many crimes, and spent actual time in jail, in prison. Marilyn Manson hasn't stepped foot in jail, and there's no talk of him actually being sentenced or even being convicted. I don't even know what the status is of that now. It's basically been all accusations. And I guess as a case, that thing is still going on. I haven't heard or followed any updates, in regards to that in a while. But, you know, at the same time, she's making an argument. Well, it's different because his audience would show up to, willingly participate, knowing that they're gonna probably be assaulted and whatnot. So they were going there to a degree as consenting adults. So it's a different scenario. But at the same time, he also was convicted of many crimes, GG Allin, and spent time in the in prison because in the eyes of the law, local law, federal law, he committed criminal acts, and it goes back to a degree of like screaming, yelling fire in a crowded theater. So it's a little bit of a different scenario. I think. I think it's more complicated than that as far as how you maneuver through that. So I don't think it was all a thing of where his audience was consenting to a degree, because he obviously was brought up on many charges, and like I said, spent many years in the prison system. But nevertheless, it's an interesting talk and an interesting discussion to get into. But I have to say, I definitely recommend. This is a not. I can't stress enough that this documentary is not easy to watch. It's it's totally insane and completely heinous and disgusting. But if you have a pretty high tolerance and a high threshold for those kinds of things, and it's definitely a look into part of our part of rock culture to a degree. I definitely recommend Hated by GG Allin. It's an amazing documentary for what it is. Subject matter, maybe not so much, but for what it is and for what it shows you and for what it puts on the table, uh, puts on the table for you as a viewer, it's uh, it's kind of out of this world. Um, yeah, I highly recommend this. So this is Jason Dean, and I really appreciate people checking out this channel and supporting it. So if you like uh, the content in these videos of this crazy thing that I'm doing, please like and subscribe to it, and we will see you next time. Peace.